Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future.
Welcome to a new episode of Shaken Not Burned. I am your co-host, Giulia Bottaro, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Felicia Jackson.
Today is going to be slightly different because we're running things today, not with me just as a co-host, but actually with my experience in sustainability. So I have been teaching sustainability, climate change at SOAS for the last 10 years. Prior to that, I've been an entrepreneur, I've been a researcher, I've been a consultant. Basically, I got into this world in 2004. That's when I really started to get involved in renewable energy. And renewable energy led me to carbon, and that led me to policy making, and that led me to the fact the global economy is undergoing a fundamental transformation. So my world is around helping people understand what's changing, why it's changing, and how we move forward surviving that change.
So we thought there isn't a better person to kick off the new season of Shaken Not Burned with. And this episode will focus on where did it all start with sustainability? How did we get here? So my first question for you, Fee, is, when did it all start? And who was the first actor or actors to realize that something needed to change? Was it the public sector, the private sector, citizens?
I think there's been a strong through line of an understanding that the way we treat nature, the way we exploit the resources around us is unhealthy. I think it's difficult to say exactly when the concept of sustainability started. You have the Limits to Growth that was written in the 60s. You have decades and decades worth of work on understanding how you can live a more sustainable life long before the 1987 Brundtland Report and the definition of sustainability that we use today. If you're thinking about it in terms of climate science and climate change, some of the first work on that was actually published in the 1800s. Certainly on a global level, it was the Rio conference in 1992 that actually came up with the three related framework conventions where there was a focus on climate change, on nature and biological diversity, and on desertification. So these three treaties were signed and agreed, and over the last more than 40 years, we're supposed to have done a whole load of work on solving these problems. As you can see from, the news in recent COPs, the Conference of the Parties, where governments get together and try and make decisions about levels of ambition and how they finance action and structuring policies to enable us to move forward in addressing these problems, they haven't always been as effective as we might like. But it's a very complicated place because there's the international community, the governments working together in a public space to try and achieve action. At the same time, you have nation states who are very concerned about their own economies, their own access to energy, their own citizens. And there's a real challenge that when you're all actively looking to grow, actively looking to access the same resources, you've got different dynamics. There are different needs and concerns. It's fascinating to me that the question of energy was seen as so important for nations that I think it was mentioned 3 times in the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first real climate treaty.
And that was in which years?
It came into force in 2005. I think it was agreed in 1997. But it took a very long time to actually get everyone to sign it off. And then once it's signed off, you have to turn around and you have to implement it in your own country. There's a lot of complications in the way the international policy environment works. The thing that's important to remember, though, is it's not just about international policy. The private sector has a very important role to play as well. And over the last few decades, we've seen this evolution from responsible investment, this idea that there is a good and a bad way to use money. That's when you started to see new funds coming into play, which, for example, would not invest in tobacco or not invest in weapons manufacturing. You had the growth of social impact and social investment. You had the growth of corporate social responsibility. Where it's got really interesting, I think, is since the early 2000s, you've seen the growth and the evolution of this from almost what we've seen as shareholder capitalism, which really comes from Milton Friedman, and that idea that the only duty of a director is to improve financial return for shareholders. This shift towards stakeholder capitalism, where you're actually saying, hang on a minute, there's so many more people affected by and involved in the operation of a business, not just shareholders, but stakeholders. And that's everyone from shareholders to employees to people affected by business operations to consumers to employees. The thing about business is that the way it's been looked at has almost been as if it operates in isolation from the world within which it inhabits and operates. We talk a lot about the concept of externalities, for example. So if you look at a business's job as being making more money, the weird thing is they get to make money. They put a price on resources that they have to buy and turn into goods. They put a price on energy. You know what your margins are. You're looking to make a profit. But at no point are the externalities of operation actually being costed into what they do. And by that, I mean, what does it cost to get water out of the ground? What is the social cost of pollution? There's a really interesting thing going on in Spain at the moment. There is a big drought, and yet there are private companies extracting water from aquifers underneath the land, which they're then bottling and selling off because that's the way the private sector's got access to it. That doesn't feel right or normal. And in a world where population is growing, climate change is accelerating, we are all battling for the same resources, and we have to find a different way of doing business if we're going to manage to keep things socially stable and sustainable.
So would you say we're still in a shareholder capitalism system rather than and slowly moving to a stakeholder one?
I think very much so. One of the things that's been really interesting over the last couple of decades is the shift towards globalization, the increased commonality between different markets and different countries. You can look at the global economy as a sort of paradigm which frames the way in which we understand how everything is done. There are more similarities between the ways different markets work than there are between individuals and cultural differences between countries. What that's meant is that the dominance of this idea of the free market has become semi-universal. And the thing that always makes me laugh is the idea of the free market actually requires completely free flow of information, which by definition cannot exist and does not exist. Therefore, we cannot have a free market. It then becomes a big issue because people are saying, the government shouldn't interfere. But at what point does a public good become something that must be dealt with? At what point does the private sector get to exploit a public good without taking any responsibility for regenerating it, for protecting it, for enacting in a way that shows a shared responsibility for it? We talk a lot about what we can do. And I think one of the things I've always said is I think the fossil fuel industry has pulled a wonderful magician's trick on the general public, which is we're all made to feel as if we are responsible for acting on climate change. We shouldn't fly, we shouldn't eat meat, we have to recycle, we shouldn't use plastics. We all know what we need to do. But in the end, we can only make choices between the choices that we're offered. And when the system that operates and underpins everything that we do is reliant on fossil fuel exploitation, is not investing sufficiently into different models, different approaches, different materials, how are we supposed to do things better? And at some point, and it's an open question as to what that point is or where that intervention should be, but at some point you have to say, this is not working. This is a system and a process that is simply going to lead to further exploitation. And if you want to survive in the long run, you can't keep operating like this. Part of this is this issue of the short term versus the long term. Because if you are, for example, a politician who's going to be elected every 4 years, or you're a CEO who may only be in the job for a couple of years, I think there was some research a couple of years ago which showed the average length of time for a Fortune 500 CEO was 18 months.
That's really short.
It's really, really short. And you're talking, if you're a public listed company, you're looking at your performance over a quarterly period. Now, you need to take a longer, more strategic view of what's going on. Because if you do not recognize the implications, the risk of the impact of climate change, you're not going to be able to manage or build resilience to shocks that may be coming down the line. There was a story, this is quite a few years ago now, but there was a big semiconductor company in Thailand and there were floods and basically the factory couldn't work. But I remember the car industry in Detroit ground to a halt because they didn't have the microprocessors necessary to put into their cars. That's the connection between different industries. If we have problems with growing zones and food being delivered, if we have problems with potable water not being available, these things have knock-on effects. And as I mentioned earlier with globalization, everything is interconnected. And so I'm just going to go back to those three treaties. Desertification.
Yeah, actually, that was going to be my first question. Next question is about what treaties have really shaped action as we know it. And, it's funny when you talk about the free market and the fact that we can't just get a unified approach if we don't have a sort of, power above all of us to sort of say, okay, let's go in this direction. Otherwise, everyone just goes in whatever direction they want.
Well, I think there's always a challenge with that because if you listen to conspiracy theorists, the UN is also a proto-government. No, but
I don't want to.
But these things happen. I've had people corner me in the back of a taxi and yell at me about how Agenda 21 is all about how the UN wants to rule the world. And I'm going, I thought it was about trying to stop poverty and encourage good health and girls' education. Did I miss something? But, there are these concerns that people have, that nations have, that someone is going to try and tell them what to do. What's really challenging is that the way business operates, the way states operate, everything seems to work in silos. Everyone is worried about their one particular problem. And even the separation of nature, desertification, and climate into 3 different treaties doesn't seem to have proved that helpful. If you think about it, most people have heard about climate change. People have started in the last couple of years to talk about nature. But it's been a 30-year period where we've lost 70% of species. The conversation is not combined. If you look at desertification, if you lose the health of the soil, if you lose water, if you turn soil into desert, then you have no resilience to climate change. That land cannot soak up water if there's a flood. In drought conditions, healthy soil will keep water for longer. That there are plants with roots. These things do not work in isolation. You have to connect them. I don't know why they decided to create 3 different treaties. I think it's possible that it was felt that they each needed very specific focus. But in many ways, it feels as if that separation has enabled people just to continue to look at them in completely separate and distinct ways. And one thing that sustainability is showing us is that you can't interfere anywhere without a knock-on effect somewhere else. That can be positive or it can be negative, but you have to know what those implications are, understand the consequences of your actions, and act in such a way as to build resilience within your systems and help to regenerate the systems around you.
And that is the long-term view that we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
So in terms of other treaties, what other deals at an I can't say that. Across government level have, shaped climate action? Obviously, I'm thinking of the Paris Agreement in 2015, and we should definitely expand on that. But were there any other?
So I think there are so many different parts of agreements. So what we've got is the framework conventions, and then under those framework conventions, individual treaties get negotiated. Obviously, the first one was the Kyoto Protocol. And in a sense, the Kyoto Protocol is the reason the Paris Agreement is the way it is, because the Kyoto Protocol had enforcement mechanisms, and it said that you had to behave in certain ways, but only certain parties were covered. In part because of the backlash to that, because, of course, there are countries that when all these negotiations started were very much developing countries. They were relatively poor, relatively under-industrialized. But the speed at which industrialization has happened has meant that some of those historical low emitters have become much higher emitters. That doesn't negate the fact that a lot of developed countries have huge historical responsibility for emissions, but it means the argument gets more complicated. It means there are countries saying, well, we're now reducing our emissions rapidly. You're the much larger emitter per capita or as a country. You should take on more responsibility. And they're going, but you're historically responsible for emissions. It's your fault we're here. We didn't do this.
The classic argument against climate action is like, oh, but China.
Yeah, exactly.
That people say here in the global north.
But people say, oh, but China's the world's largest investor in renewable energy.
Absolutely.
China is the world's largest investor in nuclear. I mean, I may not be a massive fan of nuclear, but it's certainly low carbon and it's a solution to some of the problem. One of the challenges, I think, is that everyone is trying to blame somebody else. And at the same time, there is this technocratic belief that some kind of technical solution is actually going to solve our problems. The one thing that nobody seems to talk about on a regular basis, at least not in the sort of policy world, is that policy is defined and constrained by politics. And politics is about politicians keeping themselves in power and keeping their citizens comfortable, keeping them wanting to vote for them. That might sound cynical, but the reality is that we face an awful lot of challenges, and it feels like no one is prepared to say, this is going to be hard. This is what we've got to do. We have a lot of straight, simple answers on the right. It's let's have a good catchphrase. Make America great again. Get Brexit done. It's simple, it's straight to the point. It's understandable, and it speaks to people's concerns and fears. One of the hardest challenges we face is that addressing climate change, addressing nature loss, addressing the need for sustainability is nuanced, it's complicated, it's not easy, and it's not straightforward. And at the same time, nobody wants to be told what to do. We certainly have in the UK a growing sense of, experts can't tell me what to do, what do they know? Well, they know quite a bit because that's why they're experts. So I often get told that climate people want to stop us eating meat. And there is no doubt that a plant-based diet would be better for the climate. It uses far less water. There's far less methane associated with it. The reality is if people who eat meat 5 days a week ate it 2, 3 days a week, that would make a fundamental difference in our direction of travel. We have this idea that eating meat is associated with wealth and plenty. It's not necessarily that good for your body to eat that much meat. So we have to try and find different ways of talking about it. It's not about telling people what they can't do, but about providing people with an opportunity to see how they can make their lives better.
Absolutely. So let's go back to the treaty. So you said Kyoto was sort of a precursor to Paris.
Yeah. So it was the first big climate treaty, and it took years to negotiate. So if Rio was in 1992, I think they agreed Kyoto in 1997. It took till 2005 to get it ratified, because you have to have enough countries agreeing to it for it to be ratified and therefore come into force. It was a great attempt. It was a great goal, but there was so much pushback around the idea that companies had to behave a certain way. There was a lot of confusion around the accounting and what you were supposed to do. It was the launch of the carbon markets, and that was taken advantage of in many, many different ways. And eventually, the Kyoto Protocol officially ran until 2020. But in the sort of early noughties, you had this discussion of what's going to come next. What are we going to do after Kyoto? And there was a big excitement in 2009, the famous Copenhagen COP, where there was real belief that fundamental change was about to happen. And, governments and heads of state turned up for the first time, and there was huge excitement. But it was very difficult to get the details of the treaty over the line. And in the end, a small group of countries got together and came up with a plan, and then they presented it to everyone else. And then everyone got furious because how dare you not include us? And everybody sort of went away. And then there was 6 years of struggle and argument and fighting and infighting. What was the next treaty supposed to be about? And that's how we ended up with the Paris Agreement.
So that must have been a big success, like a big feeling of hope at the time, right?
When the Paris Agreement was signed?
Yes.
Yes. I think to a certain extent, probably relief was the predominant emotion rather than excitement and success, because there are flaws. There is no enforcement. The Paris Agreement is based on the idea that peer pressure will encourage you to improve what you're doing. So you have your nationally determined contributions. You are, as a country, pushing yourself forward to show how you're going to act on climate change. There's the global stocktake, where you take note of how far you're moving. The thing I loved about the Paris Agreement is that it actually says that the goal is to keep temperature increase to 2 degrees with a goal of increasing it to 1.5. Now, we may have already hit 1.5 degrees in 2024, but under the terms of the Paris Agreement, it only counts when it's an average over 20 years, because there's a real difference between individual moments on the ground, those acute moments, and underlying shifts in how a system works, which I think of as the chronic change. And what we have with climate change is we have these acute moments that we've seen with the Valencia floods or droughts or whatever it might be. But what matters is the ongoing slow shift in water systems and nutrient systems and chemical systems. I think it's really worth looking at the planetary boundaries. So if you look at Rockstrom's work on the planetary boundaries and Kate Raworth's work on donut economics, and you see that there is a certain range within which people can live comfortably, within which they can thrive, both avoiding environmental pitfalls and avoiding social pitfalls. I mean, I love it because this is all about scale and the way in which things operate at scale. So you can look at planetary boundaries and donut economics and see the sort of the little donut, the ring within which human beings can thrive. You can look at it on a universal scale and realize that planet Earth is in the Goldilocks area. And if we were any closer to the sun, human life wouldn't exist. If we were any further away, human life wouldn't exist. We're in exactly the right place at the right space. And then you can look at that on a really micro scale. How do you live? What do you do? How do you make your life part of a happy, positive, thriving, healthy way of being? I'm sorry, I got really carried away there, but I do get quite excited by the fact that while we have these scientific bases of knowledge which show us where the problems are, it is actually in our humanity and our role as people and our ability to work together that will enable us to live within those boundaries, to live in a sustainable way, and live in a sort of kinder, better world. I now have to take back the fact I describe myself as a cynic. I can be both a cynic and an idealist.
I mean, as you said, it's a very nuanced conversation, and we can feel all the feelings at the same time. And I think that's the reason why we're here talking today, is that there's obviously the despair, but there's also the hope. So before we move on to the corporate side of things, still staying in the treaties area, what's next after the Paris Agreement? What can we expect from the next COPs?
Well, having had the most recent climate COP, which wasn't the success we might have hoped, it was known as the Finance COP. That was the key thing that needed to be agreed. And we did get some rules on the carbon markets, which was great, Article 6.4. We still have to wait a while and see how that's going to play out, because I'm not sure that anything that was agreed is going to drive demand, certainly in the voluntary markets. But I think the fact that 300 billion a year was agreed for finance for developing countries, for those most at risk from climate change, it was better than what was on the table initially. which was 250 billion. Certainly better than the 100 billion that took a number of years to reach long after it was actually promised. But the reality is, I think the COP showed a fundamental failure of understanding quite how interconnected these problems are, these crises are. If you look at 300 billion to 2035, which is what was agreed, just taking inflation into account, maybe that's 150 billion by the time you get there. It's not going to be worth the same amount. Developing countries were asking for $1 trillion. And that's the number that was calculated by UNEP as the gap in financing between what is needed for mitigation and adaptation. And the fundamental truth is, if we do not help countries adapt to the challenges of climate change, we are going to see changes in growing periods, in access to different markets, in access to different resources. We're going to see further decreases in forestation and in biodiversity. These things are all net negatives for humanity as a whole. So next year is the COP in Berlin. That has been termed the Nature COP, despite the fact we had a Nature COP quite recently. That was COP16 under the Convention for Biological Diversity. Part of the problem is the language is so confusing.
And no, they're all called COP.
Because they're all the conference of the parties to the particular framework in question. So it's just COP's the shorthand. And everyone thinks the one they're dealing with is the only one that matters, which is a bit of a challenge. We need to see more unified action, but there are understandable concerns that if we see agreements on finance that cross all three conventions, it might mean money being taken away from the thing that a particular country needs at this point. The fundamental problem, I think, that all the COPs face is a lack of trust between the parties. People haven't lived up to their promises. There are increasing dangers, and I think there's a genuine fear that as the world gets more challenging, it's going to be harder and harder to get money to act in places that aren't close to home. And one of the things that needs to be understood is that what you think is far away from home today could have a direct impact on you tomorrow. There's obviously treaties outside the three framework conventions. For example, there's a huge amount of interest in the potential for a global plastics treaty. That could be transformational if it actually addresses the manufacturing of plastic, because there are times and places where plastic is really important. It's a fantastic material. We certainly wouldn't have got through the pandemic without it. But at the same time, it's being used in so many different places in so many different ways that aren't necessary. And, not to bash the fossil fuel industry again, but, there was an expectation that as there was a shift away from petrol and diesel, that the consumption of fossil fuels would be replaced by petrochem consumption. So, you have to understand what's driving particular markets. Who is lobbying for what? I mean, there were 1,700 fossil fuel lobbyists at the last COP. It's quite hard for smaller voices to get heard when those in charge of the status quo are right at the table demanding protection. Saudi Arabia refused at one point to consider any form of language in an agreement this year if it included the transition away from fossil fuels. It's a challenge.
It's challenging. Are there any other treaties that you can think of also outside of the UN that could potentially shape the direction of travel?
It's not so much the treaties outside the UN. Okay. It's actually, I think, the actions that countries are taking themselves. And I think one of the things people often forget about the UN process is because it's there, because it's a framework showing things moving forward, however slowly, that has had a knock-on effect in how things work in the private sector and how things work on an individual nation-state basis. And you just have to look at the US, actually, because obviously there's concern about the US being pulled out of the climate treaty. But then you've got California, which is the world's fifth largest economy, which has actually put legislation in place demanding that countries report the risk of their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So you need to look at multiple levels, multiple scales, and understand where the direction of travel is, but also as a company, as individuals and countries, do you want to be playing catch up? Do you want to be caught out by the need to take certain actions? Or do you want to be a leader and start involving the need for action in your strategic plan on how you keep yourself viable for the long run?
I'm thinking of a practical example of the knock-on effect that the Paris Agreement has had. And you can tell me if I'm wrong. At the time of recording, there is a lot of discussion about a ban on new petrol and diesel cars in Europe and in the UK. The companies want it moved. The manufacturers are closing factories one after the other or just stopping production. But the governments have chosen the ban, scheduled the ban in order to meet their net zero goals, which were set as a result of the Paris Agreement. Is that correct? So,
okay, so not
this is individual country responsibility for a wider mandate.
so it's not directly related to the Paris Agreement.
Okay.
But it sort of is, because under the Paris Agreement, they have set their goals, but then they have to turn around and turn that into law domestically. So that's what's happened. So actually, in the UK, for example, it's because of the Climate Change Act. So we have a legal requirement to act in a certain way. So yes, the government is putting in plans to implement a ban because that's part of the process through which the net zero will be reached. What's really interesting to me is what you have in all the arguments and manufacturers arguing is the death throes of a dying industry. This is what happens with innovation. Things shift. Nobody at the moment, when they are listening to their streaming services, is particularly upset about their lack of an 8-track or their lack of a CD player. I mean, I'm really annoyed because I still have loads of CDs that I really liked listening to. But, that's a personal thing. You look at mobile phone cameras. I think the story goes that there was an engineer at Kodak, which was the world's largest camera company, that came up with the concept. But in Kodak, it was such an absurd idea, this tiny little camera, that nothing ever got done about it. Then it got put in a mobile phone and all our worlds changed. You have to understand there is a cycle to the way in which technologies work. There is a cycle in the way in which we use things and in which economies develop. Now, I'm not saying it's nice. I'm not saying it's easy. But what I am saying is, if things are going in a certain way, you have to get ahead of that. There's no point fighting it. I mean, fight if you want to and lobby as much as you want to. But in the end, lobbying to stop that ban, all it's going to do is slow it down. And by slowing it down, it means no one else has time to plan how to do something differently. I think the ban is currently proposed for 2035. I know a couple of years ago that it was earlier, then it got moved later. And this has been an ongoing argument for a number of years.
Yeah, a never-ending saga.
Exactly. But the point is, as a business, in the end, what you need to know is that something is going to happen at a certain time. Because if you know what's going to happen at a certain time, you can plan for it. Uncertainty, which is unfortunate because that's what climate change involves, but uncertainty is the most damaging thing for any business because you can't make a decision. You can't move in a certain direction. You're sitting there wondering what's going to happen. And that can be really, really damaging. At the EU level, we've got the CSRD and the CSDDD, and I think there's one other.
The deforestation regulation.
Yeah. But because the new parliament's been elected, there's been some pushback. I think the goals of each of these pieces of legislation is really positive, but it is onerous to have to report to each one separately. So there's discussion now of, having an omnibus in the EU and simplifying these three pieces of legislation. There's a danger that they could be weakened, but there's a possibility that it simply streamlines the way that it's done. So you have to try to work towards getting the answer you want. And don't just leave it to fossil fuel lobbyists or to car lobbyists, but actually get involved. Find out what's going on, talk to people, state your opinion to your elected representatives, because let's be honest, they don't seem to talk for us an awful lot of the time. But if we don't tell them what we want, how are they supposed to?
I think this is somewhat of a nice segue into my next question, which is about corporate sustainability. And, in the history of frameworks, what were the first frameworks? Where are we now? You did mention the European legislation we started with CSR, now we are at ESG, now ESG may be obsolete,
Well, I think
please explain.
Thinking of ESG as obsolete is not the case, but it's very easy to see it as overly politicized and something people are really nervous about talking about. That strikes me as crazy because ESG as a concept is literally a risk-adjusted investment lens. It means that you are going to look at your environmental risks, your social risks, and your governance risks and try to control them so they're not a risk to your business. Never quite understood why that's a political problem. But in terms of, the evolution of how things have gone, you've got things like the Michael Porter's creating shared value. It's this idea that value is beyond just the financial. In the 2010s, you had the concept of purpose. You've got different groups that work to align with purpose. You've got the principles of responsible investment that came out from the UN in the early noughties. It's a really complicated area because there is evidence that companies who perform better from a sustainability perspective actually perform better financially. Sometimes that could be as simple as, if you're aware of governance risks, you probably have an effective governance program in place. And that probably means you've got a better grip on what's going on in your business. I think where it's been really interesting, and actually, I think it was Paolo Tatici who was talking about this idea of the modern form of sustainability. And this is actually about enhancing competitiveness and increasing profitability through the implementation of sustainability. So it's actually, instead of sort of going, well, we're going to be very moral about this, we're going to do what is considered to be right, it's actually saying, look at what can be done by taking that approach and improve your business through doing it. It's about businesses in the end, they are about making profit. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the world in which we live. It's how you do it, how you prioritize it, and how you take knowledge to change your strategy. If you're doing ESG, for example, it's quite likely the first thing you're going to do is look at your energy consumption and make it more efficient. So why is it bad to be more energy efficient and save yourself money by not spending as much money on energy? I genuinely don't understand how ESG has become this thing that is bad. There is an issue that it does cost money. You have to monitor things. You have to have a team in place. You have to report the information you find. That's a cost center, an annoyance for any business. The point is, don't just look at it as a cost center. Take that knowledge, take that information, implement it into your strategy, and build a better business. One that is resilient, not just for tomorrow, but for the longer term. There's some really interesting stuff going on around the politicization of ESG, whether it's Republican attorney generals threatening to sue asset managers if they don't invest in coal because you can't avoid coal. Even though there was some research that came out from a state pension fund which showed that they would have lost 400 billion by they did a scenario analysis of the future of their investments, but there was going to be considerable loss associated with investing in certain coal projects and companies. Part of the reason for that is this concept of stranded assets. If you can't make enough money back off a project, it becomes stranded. When you invest in a project, you calculate how much it's going to cost and how much money you're going to make over a period of time. So with a stranded asset, you calculate whether or not it's a good investment by working out how much money you're going to make over, say, a 30-year period. If for some reason at year 20, so the price of carbon goes up or new legislation comes in and that project can no longer operate, you're making far less money than you planned. You can't afford to continue to operate it. That's a stranded asset. So that's how it changes for investors. Every business makes decisions on what the return on investment is. But it's over time and you have to think about it. There are trade-offs, there are priorities. But what you need to do is use that cost center of the information you get from your ESG work and use that to build a sustainable business There's opportunity for new products. There's opportunity for new business lines. There's opportunities for saving money. There's opportunities to build resilience from shocks in your supply chain. And you need to be able to take advantage of that. So what I think we've seen with this evolution from responsible to corporate social responsibility to responsible investment to ESG and sustainability sort of going alongside the whole way is that sustainability is about strategy. What we've seen a huge amount of in the sustainability initiatives I look at, a lot of them are about risk management. What you want to see is something that takes knowledge and information and turns it into a positive and regenerative strategy for the future.
My final question is about what is required of companies and how that has changed over time. So I'm thinking, for example, there's been a lot of discussion on emissions, and I think almost universally we can agree the emissions have to be reduced, but now there is more interest in reducing impact on nature, so like water sources, air pollution, and so on. So how have these requirements evolved over time?
Well, I think the first thing to say is you're absolutely right. Emissions are what everyone's been talking about. I find it quite frightening that I meet companies who are working on their first emissions report and I'm going, oh, you should have been doing that about 10 years ago. Okay. But it takes time. It takes time for things to become mainstream. What you have seen, the reason you've seen such a focus on emissions is because it's a proxy for climate risk. It's a means of saying I am taking positive action to ensure that I am contributing to mitigating this problem. And you have seen a shift from this is a good thing to do for your reputation because you want to be out there as a leader to an actual regulatory and legislative requirement. You know, the UK's got the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. That's actually been folded into the ISSB. I'm going to stop using acronyms.
We will have episodes about this later down the line.
Absolutely.
So this is just a little introduction to this giant world.
But so basically, most companies have understood that they need to report on their emissions. And in one way or another, they are now required to do so on a jurisdictional basis, whether that's in Europe, the UK, in California. I think there are 30 jurisdictions now where it's a requirement for a publicly listed company to report on their emissions. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is any company that reports on their emissions as a requirement needs to get information from their suppliers on their emissions so they can factor that into their footprint. So you have this cascading effect going across the supply chain. Now, where things have begun to shift, I mentioned earlier in the last couple of years, we've seen so much more conversation about nature and the impact on nature. In the UK, you've actually even got biodiversity net gain, where developers are being required to show that they have improved the biodiversity around where they have actually built a development. The reality is we are gaining a more mainstream understanding of the fact that you cannot address climate without nature. You cannot have resilience to climate change impacts without healthy nature, healthy soil, a healthy water cycle. Companies are going to be asked, I think it was the year before last that the Convention on Biological Diversity made an agreement on protecting 30% of land and ocean by 2030. That's less than 5 years away. In order to do that, they are going to have, these countries are going to have to require companies and institutions to be more positive about their impact on nature. And the first thing they're going to have to do is measure it and report it. And these are very challenging issues. Biodiversity, for example, you cannot fix something in one area and claim it for another area because it's completely local. Emissions, they may come from a particular point source, but they affect the climate as a whole. With nature and biodiversity, it's really immediate and it's local and it's on the ground and you have to protect it. Quite how that's going to play out, I don't know, but what you are seeing, and I'm talking again about direction of travel, there is a growing need and requirement for reporting on your impact and on showing what you're going to do about minimizing that impact and potentially regenerating things around you due to the way that you work.
Thank you, Fee. It's been an amazing explanation. And as I said, an introduction. There is so much we're going to cover in this new season. Is there anything else you would like to add?
The only thing I would actually say is that And this is something that actually came up when I was teaching, because you learn things in a linear fashion, because you have to read things, you have to learn about them, you have to go through the process. It's only once you've learned them all that you understand how they all interconnect. So what I would actually say is that sometimes all of this sounds so complicated and there's so many acronyms and so many different things going on, but actually it's really simple. It's just about understanding the world in which we live. It's understanding that our economy matters, but our economy is rooted in nature. An economy doesn't exist without the world on which it's built, and that we all need to be kinder to each other about the challenges we face and how we actually address them. And if anyone has any questions or they want anything explained, then get in touch with us and let us try and help make it easier.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much to our listeners as well. And we shall see you in our next episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter, like our LinkedIn and Instagram pages. And yeah, get in touch if you want. See you next week.